Australian. Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I'd like to begin by making what I think is an important and what should be an obvious point, but one which has been largely missed in the debate so far. And that is this. Donations reform, including banning foreign donations, would not have protected Senator Dastyari from his own poor judgment. And that is because Senator Dastyari did not receive a foreign donation. He received a gift. The most regulated political donation system in the world would not have helped Senator Dastyari. I acknowledge that there are very well-meaning advocates of change, of more regulation for donations, including in my own party, and there certainly are imperfections in the current donation system which could be improved. It is appropriate that there be a review of the system that we have in place, and the best vehicle for that review is the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, which is very capably chaired by my colleague Senator Reynolds. But I want to issue a note of caution. Donation reform is not something to rush into without careful consideration of the full implications of change. One idea which has been widely suggested is that we confine donations to people who are on the electoral roll. That is, effectively, to ban donations from unions, businesses and not-for-profit organisations. This reform would, at least to its credit, have the benefit of being relatively politically neutral between left-of-centre and right-of-centre political parties, unlike the shamelessly self-interested proposal by the Greens to only ban businesses from making donations, but to continue to allow unions and NGOs to donate. But I think it is misguided for other reasons. Firstly, it is almost certain to be unconstitutional following the 2014 Unions New South Wales case. That case found that the Australian people have an implied right to participate in the democratic process by making donations to political parties and other organisations which campaign in and around elections. Crucially, what that judgment found was that just because some Australians choose to exercise this democratic right collectively through an organisation does not mean that they should lose that right. That is a very sensible and philosophically sound conclusion. After all, a business, a union, a not-for-profit organisation is just a vehicle for individual citizens to come together to advance their objectives as a group. Any right which an individual possesses alone, they should be able to exercise collectively. Setting aside constitutional questions, though, it is also my personal view that banning donations from all third parties to political parties is misguided for other reasons. As we have seen elsewhere around the world, particularly in the United States, attempts to prevent organisations like companies from donating directly to political parties just encourages them to seek to influence political outcomes using other means. For example, they may set up third-party organisations of their own and fund them generously to engage in either issues-based advocacy or even quasi-partisan advocacy that occurs alongside political parties in elections. By their very nature, these third-party organisations will never be subject to the same standards, the same scrutiny or the same regulation that a political party is and can be. For the sake of transparency, we should encourage those that do seek to influence the political system, as is their right in a free and democratic country, to do so through the most formal channels available. There are those that say we could solve this problem and prevent it from occurring simply by regulating the conduct or even banning third-party organisations from campaigning. Again, this is highly likely to be found to be unconstitutional, but I also think it is wrong. In a free country, civil society organisations must have the freedom to advocate their interests and the interests of their members. It cannot be that the only legitimate vehicle to participate in the political process is through an established political party. Many propose that if we were to substantially regulate donations, then we could replace any of the lost revenue from political parties from those donations with more public funding. And I have to say that is not an approach that I support. Firstly, I am sure that we can all think of a better use of taxpayers' money than paying for political campaigning. As politicians, I think we sometimes already test the patience of our constituents at election time. Imagine how they would feel if they knew that virtually every ad they saw on television or virtually every letter or pamphlet they received in their letterbox was funded by their own taxes. Secondly, and you may be surprised to hear me say this, but I think that public funding, which is typically awarded on the basis of the vote received after an election, gives a huge advantage to incumbent political parties. As a major political party, we can spend, and if necessary we can borrow, with certainty during an election campaign, knowing full well that we will be effectively reimbursed for that expenditure after the election with public funding, because we have a relatively predictable share of the primary vote, whether we are going to win an election or lose it. A new political party does not have this same certainty. Until they've run at least a few times, they cannot be sure how much of the vote they will get and therefore the amount of public funding that they would receive after the election. It would be even more difficult for a new party to compete with existing ones who are lavishly funded with public support if we limit their ability to raise private donations. Thirdly, increasing public donations continues further down the road of fundamentally changing the relationship between the state and political parties. I acknowledge we've already taken some steps down this road, but it is not one that I'm keen to continue down any further. It would give the state more power over parties, especially opposition parties and minor parties. It is not all that hard to foresee, as our former Prime Minister John Howard pointed out this week. A future government which imposes onerous and potentially partisan conditions on an opposition political party in order for that political party to receive funding. If we have at the same time curtailed their ability to raise those funds privately, they will be at the mercy of the government of the day. In a free and democratic society, we should all be concerned about this prospect. We will all be in opposition at some period during our time here. Finally, I think there is an important broader point here. If you don't want people to seek to influence political parties and governments with donations, then there is a much better way than just regulating those donations. While ever government is large and intervenes heavily in our economy and our society, there will be people who profit from that and people who lose from that. There will be people who benefit and lose from government decisions, and they will always have the incentive to use whatever means possible, whatever means available, to try and influence those decisions. Instead of further regulating donations, we could instead choose to tread more lightly on society and the economy. The smaller the government is, the less capacity it has to do favour or harm to individuals, to businesses and to civil society, and the less incentive they have to try to influence us through political donations. I want to end on a note of bipartisanship and congratulate Senator Conroy for his excellent contribution to the debate earlier on the hypocrisy of the Greens. And I also want to congratulate Senator Rhiannon for her honesty. I marvel at the clearness of advertising in their fundraising program called Democracy for Sale. We know what democracy costs in the Greens political party. It's $1.6 million. And if you've got that, if you're an eminent businessman like Graham Wood, then you have the capacity to buy them for $1.6 million. Because Graham Wood said after the election that it was a great return on investment, and Senator Bob Brown, the former leader of the party, said he would be forever grateful. So we know what the price of democracy is in the Greens political party. I'd also like to point out that the Greens often rail against some industries, such as the fossil fuel industry, for making donations to political parties. I am yet to hear them complain about a new emerging player in the donation space, and that is the renewable energy industry, which also now makes very generous donations to all sides of politics. And it is an industry whose profitability and viability is inextricably linked to the regulations it receives from government. We saw during the debate about the renewable energy target that the whole viability of renewable energy companies is threatened if that favourable regulation and the subsidies they receive did not exist. Now, if there is ever a better example of an industry which uses political donations to curry favour with governments oppositions and, yes, even minor parties, then I think you can't look much further than the renewable energy industry.
Thank you, Senator